Hey, this is the League of Women Voters of Colorado JEDI meeting, which is Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Task Force. My name is Kathy Ebersberger, and I'm the chair of the task force. I'd like to remind everybody at the start of the meeting that when you registered for the meeting, you agreed to abide by the rules of the League of Women Voters of the United States and the League of Women Voters of Colorado, as set out in each league's bylaws and official policies, including the diversity, equity, and inclusion policy. You agreed not to act in opposition to a league position or policy when acting on behalf of the league. You agreed that all knowledge and information gained from proprietary information and discussion of the League of Women Voters shall be regarded as strictly confidential and shall remain the sole and confidential property of the League of Women Voters. You've agreed to not engage in any behaviors or actions that are harassing, threatening, physically or verbally abusive toward any employee of the league, member of the public, member of the league, and also not to create an environment that's intimidating, hostile, or offensive. This includes online activity. You also understand that photos and video of me may be taken in connection with my participation, and these photos and videos are the sole property of the League of Women Voters of Colorado. Tonight we have a really interesting topic. It's very timely, and that is the Alien Enemies Act, which was recently invoked by the administration to deport a group of Venezuelan immigrants. Our speaker tonight is Dean UNO. Is that right, Dean?
Yes.
Dean's a military veteran, having served 29 years on active duty in the U.S. Army, including a deployment to Iraq. He retired with the rank of colonel in 2013. During his career, he served as a deputy commander for the Europe Regional Dental Command, overseeing Army dental clinics in Germany, Italy, Belgium, and the Netherlands. He also served as a deputy commander for the Southeast Regional Dental Command, covering a 7-state area from Texas to Georgia and South Carolina. Dean lives with his wife, Wendy, in Heather Gardens. They moved to Colorado in 2018 to be closer to their grandchildren. Dean's parents, along with their families, were forcibly removed and incarcerated at the concentration camp in Heart Mountain, Wyoming, during World War II. And he'll present his program tonight, Numbers, the Past Prologue, the mass incarceration of American citizens during World War II, and its continuing relevance. So, Dean, thank you very much for being here. We really appreciate it.
All right. Thank you for having me. Again, Kathy already read my title, The Numbers, Past Prologue, and it's about the mass incarceration of American citizens during World War II and its continuing relevance. And I'll have to advance it like that. So let me give you an overview first. I divided this into 2 parts. The first part is what's past its prologue, and I'd like to talk about the Alien Enemies Act and Executive Order 9066 and how that was used in World War II. And one of the things I'll just touch on briefly is how the American media was manipulated to cover up actual conditions in the camps from the American public. Part 2, we'll talk about the Alien Enemies Act in a little more detail. We'll talk about the Korematsu Supreme Court case and why that's still relevant today. So let me give you a little background. Part 1 is based on my parents' personal account of the forced evacuation and incarceration without due process that occurred during World War II. In 1991, while I was home on military leave, my wife Wendy and we decided to record oral histories of our parents, and we were thinking before they got too aged to, be coherent enough to do that. So It wasn't until 2013, after I retired, that I actually had time to transcribe those recordings, because I wanted them to be in a more permanent format. And fortunately, we were living in Nashville, Tennessee at the time, so so-called Music City. And I looked online, and there was one of the studios, one of the guys, he agreed to help me out, and he would take the cassette tape where the original recording was, and he actually turned it into a more durable format and burned a bunch of copies for me. So that way I sent them out to the rest of the family, and that way we can preserve that. But anyway, the camp experience wasn't exactly the same for all of the people that were incarcerated, but looking through my parents' account and then other written accounts, for everybody was very similar. And that's good, because my father was a man of very few words. So there's places where I have to fill in some gaps, and I can do that by using the historical count that's on record. So what I'd like to start off first with a little terminology, and why, because words matter. Aiko Herzig Yoshinaga is one of the researchers that back, I think, in the 80s, so like literally 40 years after the war, discovered in the National Archives evidence that the government, while representing themselves in front of the Supreme Court, actually massaged and hid some evidence that never made it in front of the Supreme Court for review. And one of the things she found out as she was looking through these archives is that there was a lot of euphemisms used, and euphemisms can mislead the public about actual events. That was true in the 1940s, and it remains true today. So since the 1970s, historians, educators, journalists, and others have advocated for the use of more accurate terminology when representing the history of this time period in World War II. So let's talk first about the term forced removal versus evacuation. Forced removal is the preferred term, because evacuation, the actual definition of that is removal of people from an endangered area. That's what they term the forced removal of Japanese Americans from the West Coast. But it's like, and we know this living in Colorado, when they have these wildfires that threaten housing tracts, people have to be evacuated. And we all know that what happened in World War II wasn't anything like that. Incarceration versus internment. Internment refers to the detention of enemy aliens in a time of war. The fact of the matter is that the majority of the incarcerees were American citizens. Incarcerees versus evacuees. The War Relocation Authority and the War and State Departments, they didn't use the word internees due to political ramifications. And the political ramifications were, they didn't want to ruffle the feathers of our World War II allies, because it basically didn't look good. Oh, they're interning their own citizens, or incarcerating their own citizens. So the official government records always use terms like evacuees, residents, relocatees, etc. Japanese Americans versus Japanese. Using the term solely the term Japanese erases the American identity of the majority of the incarcerees. It's sort of like removing their citizenship from them. So the government used the term non-alien to describe Japanese American citizens in their public documents. Detention facility versus assembly center. Assembly center was used in the official government documents, and you may hear me use that term a couple times during this presentation when I'm referring to a citation out of an official government document. But detention facility is a preferred term, because that's what it was. It was places that were surrounded by barbed wire fences, and they were guarded by military police. concentration camps versus relocation centers. The relocation center was the preferred term of the government, but a more accurate term is concentration camp. Now, before we get into that definition, some of you may be thinking, well, wait a minute, because a lot of times if we're like playing the word association game, you'd say concentration camp, and a lot of Americans immediately think of the Nazi concentration camps during World War II. This did create some controversy, and so a joint working group of Jewish Americans and Japanese Americans met. They had a committee to resolve their differences. And on the Japanese American side, they said, look, we in no way, shape, or form mean to equate our relatives' experience during World War II with the Nazi death camps. So, but the Jewish committee realized, though, that there was merit in being able to use this term concentration camp. So the definition that they came up with is a concentration camp is a place where people are in prison, not because of any crimes they've committed, but simply because of who they are. So based on what ethnic origin you have, on your race, on your religion. And it's actually, the term concentration camp has been around since the turn of the 20th century. Actually, in 1898, during the Spanish-American War, it was used by the Americans when we imprisoned people in the Philippines. It was used by the English during the Boer Wars in South Africa. And they all had one thing in common, and it's been used by several countries since then, is people in power removed a minority group from the general population and the rest of society let it happen. So I'd like to read a poem to you. I wrote this poem in February 2017, and I had no idea that this was ever going to be used as part of my presentation for the Heather Garden Social Justice Group or for this presentation tonight. And it was published in the spring edition of a magazine that's published by the Heart Mountain Foundation. The Heart Mountain Foundation is a group that came out of the Heart Mountain, Wyoming concentration camp. Numbers 12/7/41. December 7th, 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor. 9066. Executive Order 9066. The forced evacuation of people of Japanese ancestry from the West Coast. 10. 10 confinement camps on American soil. Barbed wire, guard towers, guns. 120,000. Nearly 120,000 incarcerees, families, fathers, mothers, sons, daughters, grandparents, American citizens. 32113 and 91611. Family number 32113. Family number 91611. 27 and 28. Questions 27 and 28 of the loyalty questionnaire. 8/10/1988. August 10th, 1988. The Civil Liberties Act of 1988, also known as the Japanese American Redress Bill, was signed to correct, quote, a grave injustice deeply rooted in racial prejudice, wartime hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. Numbers and lessons. So the reason I wanted to read you that poem, like with my presentation to the Heather Garden Social Justice Group, it provides a good framework to recount the important events that resulted from Executive Order 9066. So the question is, have we in our country and society learned these lessons? And that's why I closed the poem. I say no, in my opinion. And first I can point to post 9/11 hysteria. And those of you that remember that day, remember shortly afterward, numerous people were proposing the rounding up of everybody of Arabic heritage. There was fortunately organized protests, and people said not again. And a lot of those people were Niseis, or which is second generation Japanese Americans, or their children that said, we lived through this before. This is not happening again in our country. Our very own Department of Justice documented numerous cases of hate crimes against people of Arabic and Sikh ancestry. And today we're seeing this again with anti-immigrant sentiments and actions. So let's go by the numbers. 12/7/1941, Pearl Harbor. There was a roundup of Japanese American community leaders. And one of the things that we know from the historians is the FBI had been compiling a dossier of these community leaders for a number of months prior to Pearl Harbor. I think everybody at that point that was paying attention realized that the United States was headed for war, even though there was a very isolationist faction that wanted us to stay out of it. But they had these dossiers prepared, and these were people like religious leaders, be they Buddhist or Methodist or Catholic. These were people like, if you were the leader of the Japanese American Community Center in your town, you were on that list. If you were the teacher in the Japanese language school, you were on that list. If you were the leader of a Japanese American social club in your community, you were on that list. And these people were all rounded up shortly after Pearl Harbor. I remember during my oral interview asking my mom, well, what was the feeling like, like in your household? And she said that it was mixed. There was an angst, but there was also an anger, and basically anger at Japan, because they knew that this was going to basically create a backlash for them, and it certainly happened. 9066, Executive Order 9066. Notices such as these were posted in Japanese American communities all up and down the West Coast, and they had dates to report for, quote, evacuation, some of them giving people as little as 2 weeks to basically get their affairs in order. Now, there was little opposition in 9066, but Governor Ralph Carr was one of the few to do so, and he's actually one of my heroes. I took this picture. This is his statue at Sakura Square downtown in Denver. And I believe that, he took a stand of conscience, and I believe that he knew that there was going to be consequences for him. And but he took this courageous stand anyway, and consequently, he was not reelected. There were other prominent members in Roosevelt's cabinet that tried to dissuade him from doing this. Among them was Attorney General Biddle and the Secretary of the Interior Ix, but that sort of fell on deaf ears, I think. So the number 10, there were 10 concentration camps in the United States. Now there were actually more than that, but these are the 10 main camps that were run by the War Relocation Authority. There were some other camps run by the FBI, et cetera, but they weren't nearly as large as the numbers that you see on the map there. 120,000, excuse me a minute. 120,000 people were forcibly removed. I'm gonna get a drink of water here too. So this was entire families, including young children. Over 2/3 were American citizens, and the remainder of those were people like my grandparents. And then, by the way, this is a family picture of them in their home in Mountain View, California, before they were before 9066 came out. But anyway, folks like my grandparents, there was a federal law at the time that barred Asians from becoming naturalized citizens. So even though they wanted to become citizens, federal law prohibited it. 32113 and 91611. These were numbers assigned to our family. And I personally find that rather dehumanizing. I mean, it's not as bad as, like, for instance, the people in Auschwitz that got their number tattooed on the inside of their forearm, but dehumanizing nevertheless. But anyway, the families were issued a family number. They were issued tags with this number that they had to put on their person and on their luggage. And their luggage wasn't much because the decree said that they were only allowed to bring what they could carry. So in most cases, that was like one suitcase. And I read numerous stories of families with young children because they didn't know if the families were going to be separated. So they put like extra food and stuff in the kids' suitcases in case they got separated from the adults. To go along with all this, of course, there was loss of possessions and property. I remember my mom saying my grandfather was one of the first people in the Japanese community to actually own a car, and he was very proud of it. And he had to sell it for pennies on the dollar because the the citizens that were remaining in each community, they would make these very lowball offers, and they said, "Look, you know, you can take it or leave it. This is my offer. But if you don't sell to me, then somebody's going to get it after you leave for nothing, for free. So, you know, what are you going to do? They had you over a barrel." My mom talks about Santa Anita Racetrack was used as a temporary detention facility. Now, these are places that the government termed assembly centers. And they were done very hastily because they didn't have the that map that I showed you with the 10 major camps. Those weren't ready yet because they were building those from scratch. So they had these all up and down the West Coast. They use a lot of them, like Tanforan racetrack up in the San Francisco Bay Area was used as one. Um, my folks coming from San Jose, it was sort of puzzling to me why they sent them. Santa Anita Racetrack is down in the Los Angeles area. Why they sent them all the way down to Southern California is beyond me. But I remember my mom during our oral interview, and she said, "Oh yeah, you could tell that they really sort of did minimal to clean out the horse stalls." And she said it still smelled of manure. Other reports say that they did try to whitewash the interior of the stalls, but it was done so hastily, like you could see um, loose horsehair that got painted into the whitewash. So Heart Mountain Camp. My mom also mentioned that on the day that they were being told that they had to load up on the train to go to Heart Mountain, and she said it was just like in this picture. There's these guards lined up, and you can see in this picture. I'll use a cursor there. So a couple of these windows are open, but once they got on the train, they were forced to close all the windows and pull the shades down because they didn't want anybody looking out. And there was a couple guards on each train car to make sure no one escaped. And they said it was, you know, with the windows down and everything, it was stifling in there. And the trip from Santa Anita to Hard Mountain should maybe take, like, if we did it today, driving on the interstate, would be maybe 3 days. But it took several days because the war was on, and these trains had a much lower priority. So anytime a higher priority train either coming in either direction, um, their priority superseded theirs, so they were pulled off on a siding and they had to wait till that train passed, and then they were allowed maybe to go back on if there wasn't another train coming that had a higher priority. So it took several days, and there were no sleeper cars. They had to sleep sitting up. So several days traveling out to Wyoming in this manner. So this is Heart Mountain Camp. You can see the guard tower. This is the namesake Heart Mountain, and here's a line of barracks. And my mother said a lot of the people, and they said this back at Santa Anita too, because one of the things the government tried to sell them on is, oh, look, we're putting you in the camps. This is for your own protection because people are getting, pretty hostile out there. And they noticed that the machine guns were pointing into the camp in both Santa Anita and at Hart Mountain. So they're saying, if this is supposed to be for our protection, why aren't the guns pointed the other way? Good question. So the barracks, my mom said they were constructed hastily by the War Relocation Authority, and they put them up so quickly. In a lot of cases, green wood was used, and this experience, it was basically repeated in the other 9 camps from all the accounts that I've read. And if you've done any carpentry before, you know that when you use green wood, as it dries, it shrinks. And my mom said, so there was these planks and there was gaps in between the planks. And Hart Mountain is a very windy place. Wendy and I had the privilege of visiting the interpretive center there. And when we went, I think it was in the month of June several years ago, it was very windy out there. And my mom said that it was so windy, like you could dust inside in the morning. And then when you came back after lunch, there was so much dust that got blown into the cracks that it looked like you hadn't even dusted. And in the wintertime, it was worse because then the cold wind started coming in. And I think at that point, she said people started trying to take mud and everything to plug the little gaps in the planks. So, excuse me a minute. One of the things that we saw at the interpretive center at Hart Mountain was what I call, with apologies um, to the authors, that I call it the tale of 2 barracks explains to actually to Charles Dickens. Apologies to him. The tale of 2 barracks displays, and what this was, they inside the interpretive centers, like a museum now, they had a full scale mock-up of what one of the barracks rooms looked like. But they had divided it in half, and on one side, they showed the barracks rooms as they actually were at Hart Mountain at the time. And so basically, gaps in the planks, like we talked about, um, the inmates were using burlap sacks because there was a lot of scrounging going on. So anything like, oh, you're going to throw away that burlap sack? Here, we'll take it. And they used those like as makeshift curtains, and sometimes they used them as a little floor covering. And the cots that were used as beds. Now, I call it the tale of 2 barracks because on the other half of that, the museum staff showed that this is what they had, like 1 or 2 show barracks, and I call them show barracks because that's what they showed people from the media. They didn't get to see the real thing. And on the other half of this display was a very nice barracks with wallpaper up, rugs on the floor, nice curtains, nice furniture like an easy chair, and a nice bed and everything, which looked like a modern apartment or modern for the 1940s. And I realized that this was a very graphic display of the propaganda that was done for the benefit of the media. So I'd like to read something that sort of highlights how this was done. At Santa Anita, which we mentioned already, here's the LA Times version of that. On April 4th, 1942, the LA Times wrote about opening day at the Santa Anita facility under the headline, Santa Anita gates open to 1,000 Japs. That was the headline. The article stated, most of the new arrivals loved the place at first glance, expressing open admiration of the beauty of the surroundings, their faces wreathed in smiles. Not really. But that's the propaganda that the American public was reading. So And you heard my mom's account of the actual conditions, and this was corroborated by numerous others. And here's another piece of information. According to the local hospital records of the Santa Anita inmates, 75% of the illnesses were attributed to living in these unsanitary stalls. So conditions in the camps. One of the things that the government did is to deflect accusations that they were, quote, coddling the incarcerees. The Army's Wartime Civil Control Administration spent an average of only 33 to 39 cents a day per inmate for food. And that was a fraction of the cost that they were using to feed each soldier. This is a statement by Robert Ritsuru Osakawa of Seattle, Washington, who was incarcerated at age 24. When we read reports in the papers of our luxurious quarters and lavish food, we resented deeply these untruths by ignorant politicians. When several senators proposed an investigation of conditions, we encouraged just that. So basically, we're inviting, well, if you think that we're getting coddled, come on and see for yourself. Over time, a handful of photographers captured the incarceree experience. The War Relocation Authority hired Dorothea Lange, who was known for her portrait Migrant Mother and other famous photos during the Great Depression. They hired her to photograph the forced removal process and incarceration life. However, her photographs capturing the hardships were so unflinching that the government impounded them until 1972, years after the war, because it would have been an indictment on conditions in the camps. So this is Heart Mountain. This is a picture of my father. Here's another panorama. And this is a picture. This is my cousin Karen, who unfortunately has passed on now, but her name was Chieko, her Japanese name, but everybody, all the relatives called her Chico. This is my grandmother, who unfortunately I never had the privilege of meeting because she died from heart failure a couple years before I was born. So this is a picture of the interpretive center that I mentioned a few slides earlier. You can see they kept one of the guard towers here. And I thought it was interesting what the architect did. He used 3 of the barracks buildings. He preserved those and like they refurbished them. And you can see they built this modern building behind to connect the 3. And then they remodeled the interiors of these to become part of the museum. And when Wendy and I were walking through there, as soon as you walk in, the main entrance is right there. You're greeted at the door by one of the docents, and they had you sign the guest log and everything. And then we're walking through the building, and we started talking. And she asked me about my parents. Now, I should say, just clarify, when my father was incarcerated at Hart Mountain, he went in as a bachelor. My mom went in with her family, and so my parents didn't know each other in Hart Mountain. They hadn't met each other yet because because they didn't think it was a good idea, and it's probably true, not to put the single men in with the families. So they had separate bachelor's quarters, and they weren't allowed to intermingle much. But anyway, this docent was asking me about our families that were in there. And I said, oh yeah, my dad was part of the Fair Play Committee. And we turned this corner and I said, and there he is. And what I was pointing to, this picture here, I had seen before and actually had a copy of it. So I recognize it, but they had blown it up to maybe 4 feet by 5 feet or something like that. And this arrow here, this is my dad kneeling in the first row here. This is a picture that was taken on the day that these gentlemen were released from McNeil Island Federal Penitentiary. Now, I didn't know, and this is how reticent my dad was to talk about certain events. Now, I was like 37 or 38 at the time we were doing this oral interview, and that was the first time I had heard that my dad was in the federal penitentiary for being part of the Fair Play Committee. So these, and there were 63 of them in all that were that stood trial and were convicted. This isn't nearly that number. So I think what they did is when they released them in batches, and this was taken on the day that they released, and these are all their prison issued suits. So 27 and 28, these are questions 27 and 28 of the loyalty questionnaire. The loyalty questionnaire was devised because right after Pearl Harbor, anybody of any Japanese American male that normally would have been of draftable age, they weren't even allowed to volunteer because they were automatically qualified as 4C, meaning enemy alien, by the draft board. As the war went on and they needed more manpower, at first the government tried asking for volunteers. That failed miserably because in all 10 camps, I mean, you can imagine you've been stripped of your constitutional rights and incarcerated for nothing other than except that you were of Japanese ancestry. And then they were asking for volunteers. So that failed miserably. So what they decided is to reinstitute the draft. But in order to do that, President Roosevelt insisted that we only want people that we can prove they're loyal to the United States. So they developed this loyalty questionnaire. There were several questions. Questions 27 and 28 are just two of them. But, you know, you can see 27, are you willing to serve in the armed forces of the United States? Question 28 essentially asks them, will you forswear any form of allegiance, obedience to the Japanese emperor and swear instead allegiance to the United States? So these questions were controversial and created a lot of turmoil in camp. And so why the uproar over these two questions? Well, I mean, and it really divided to the camps, some of the camps where they had physical violence where, you know, people were hitting each other, not just with fists, but with boards and stuff too. So some of the young men agreed to be inducted. Those became the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. And to this day, to my knowledge, it's still the most decorated Army unit for its size and length of service. But why the uproar over these questions? The first point of contention, let me drink some water here. A lot of the men said, look, you want us to fight in the military, which is fine, but and that's a citizen's privilege to risk your life for your country. But they said, if you want us to do that, then restore our constitutional rights. The second question was the one that created even more controversy because there was a lot of argument back and forth. And, you know, like you got these hot-blooded, red-blooded young men, and a big faction in all 10 camps said, it's a trick question. How can we forswear allegiance to the Japanese emperor? We never been to Japan. We don't know him from Adam. So they said, you know, this is a lot of them convinced themselves it's damned if we do and damned if we don't. If we say yes, we do forswear, then they say, aha, you were allegiant to the Japanese emperor before. And so, you know, they had these arguments over that. And so some men refused induction and were arrested. The Heart Mountain group of draft resistors, these 63 men of the Fair Play Committee, were one of them. And everything that I've read said that Heart Mountain, Wyoming, was the only camp that had an organized resistance group. Everybody else decided as individuals, and there were draft resistors in all 10 camps. But the 63 men of the Fair Play Committee, they acted in unison. And since they refused induction, a lot of them, they got their notice and they refused to go to their draft physical, which is what my dad did. And shortly after, the U.S. Marshals entered camp and they put handcuffs on him and they led him away to first to the jail in Cheyenne. The jail was wasn't big enough, so they had to send them out to some outlying communities. And they were tried in federal court in Cheyenne. And it's still, to this day, the largest mass trial that the state of Wyoming has ever had. So I talked a little bit about this. Fair Play Committee was this group of men. Now, there was younger men. The 63 younger men were tried right away and sent off to prison. There was 2 or 3 older men who were above draft age, but they were advising these younger men, and they were part of the Fair Play Committee. The government came back and got them later because apparently it's against federal law to basically encourage others not to comply with the draft board. So they were tried on that, and because they were older, they were actually sent to Fort Leavenworth in Kansas. So anyway, they formed this group because they called it, very aptly named, Fair Play. They said, well, look, if you want us to fight, then we want to be, we want fair play. You violated our constitutional rights as American citizens. So they had requirements to join the Fair Play Committee. You had to state that you were loyal to the United States, and you also had to state that you were willing to serve in the U.S. military once your rights were restored. They also had another requirement. Then they insisted that they be allowed to serve in an integrated unit. So, not all Japanese Americans with white officers. They wanted an integrated unit, with to be able to serve with everybody else. And the Army is the one that nixed that because they started thinking, people higher up in the Army chain of command, hey, if we let them integrate, then we're going to have to let our African American units integrate, and they weren't prepared to do that in the 1940s. So anyway, like I said, they had this mass trial in Cheyenne, Wyoming, and I'd like to read this excerpt about how that trial went. These are the words of Jack Tono from San Jose, California, who was also at Santa Anita and in Hart Mountain and served time with my father at McNeil Island Federal Penitentiary. To this day, I can recall the event that took place the first day of our trial. When the judge was informing us of the agenda for the following day, he referred to us as "you Jap boys," and then quickly corrected himself. Then and there we knew we were up against a stacked deck. Here was a man, supposedly a man of high esteem and integrity, sitting on the federal bench who was nothing more than a racist and a bigot. Now let me give you the after story. Although President Harry S. Truman pardoned the convicted draft resistors in December 1947, they remained stigmatized by others in the Japanese American community who considered them cowards instead of patriots standing up for principles of conscience. When Jack Tono received his presidential pardon, he tore it up and burned it. So this is McNeil Island. It's in Puget Sound up in Washington State. You can sort of consider it like the Alcatraz of the Pacific Northwest, because like Alcatraz is an island in the middle of the frigid and shark infested waters of San Francisco Bay. McNeil Island is the same in the middle of Puget Sound. And there was a boat that came in like somewhere, I think the landing was right there, once or twice a week to bring supplies. Other than that, there was no communication with the mainland. So after the war, everybody that was released, they had to start from scratch to rebuild their lives. My father, in his oral interview, he recounts that it was a pretty tough world. He had to moonlight to make ends meet. And for a while, he said he had a menial job in a sheet metal shop. Now, thank God for the kindness of strangers, because he said he identified and asked a friendly foreman to teach him to weld with these scrap pieces of metal that were lying around the shop. And so the guy taught him. And then my dad said, like, and when the lunch hour would come, he would wolf down a sandwich really quick and then use the remaining time of his lunch hour to practice welding. Eventually got proficient enough that he was able to be hired as a welder, which was a much better paying job. So again, after the war, rebuilding lives. Now, until I read this, I used to think that drive-by shootings were basically a more current event, like, we invented that out in California, like with the gangs and stuff, fairly recently. But I read this and realized I was mistaken. Here's a newspaper article that recounted these drive-by shootings that were the 18th and 19th shooting attacks against persons of Japanese ancestry who tried to return to California. Excuse me. There was also an LA Times headline saying this is before they heard that the government was going to start releasing people from the camps. And they said, writing predicted an event, Japs returned to California. I would like to read this excerpt now. These are the words of Toshi Ito talking about the return to California. Excuse me. My parents went back to LA in January of 1945 when the war was still raging and prejudice ran high. Our homecoming was not a happy one. A sign, "No Japs Wanted Here," was posted on the front lawn of our home. My father was 56 years old and had been an insurance agent most of his adult life. Try as he did to find a job, any kind of job, no one would hire him. His license to sell insurance was revoked soon after the war began. The neighborhood grocery, where we had traded for years, would not sell groceries to us. My father was so depressed at not being able to find a job, he took his own life. So there was a mental health impact too. And I read this when I was doing research for the Heather Garden's presentation, and I'd never thought about this. I'd only thought about the economic cost, but there was a big psychological cost too. So as I started looking into this, became very interesting for me. Some of you are familiar with the Holmes-Rahe life stress scale. It's that thing where, you go through this list of different life events and each one scores a different amount of, quote, stress points. A score of 300 plus means there's an 80% chance that you're going to have a major health breakdown in the future. And so what I did is I took that stress scale and I went through for the adults and the children, and I checked off as many of those events as I thought applied for these people that had to be forced out of their homes. And you can read some of the stressors there for yourselves, but the estimate that I came up with is probably for the average adult, their stress score was 350 or higher. And for children, it was right around 300. So pretty stressful time. Now, I also read there was some studies by trained psychologists and psychiatrists, and they went back and basically interviewed numerous people that had to go through this experience. And one of the things, and this is across studies, so across several studies, many of the researchers said, hey, these folks have the same symptoms of PTSD. So I thought that was very interesting, and it's a thing that I had never thought of until I started digging into it a little bit. So 8/10/1988, the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. I read a little excerpt from that I captured in my poem, but I'd like to read to you a little more complete account. So in 1988, Congress enacted and President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, also known as the Japanese American Redress Bill. Our Congress recognized that, and this is a quote, as described in the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians, and I'll do a little aside, that was a committee appointed by Congress to look into some of these things. So this committee described that in their report, a grave injustice was done to both citizens and permanent alien residents of Japanese ancestry by the evacuation, relocation, and internment of civilians during World War II. As the commission documents, these actions were carried out without adequate security reasons and without any acts of espionage or sabotage documented by the commission, and were motivated largely by racial prejudice, wartime hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. So at the very last line of my poem, I say numbers and lessons. There's a lesson in all this, and I can encapsulate it in 2 words. It's constant vigilance. And why? Because it can happen again. And we've seen numerous examples of this. Some of you may be aware of the story of the young Chinese American man that was slain in Detroit. It was a number of years ago now. And it was a time when Japanese imports were really outcompeting the big 3 American brands. And so there was a couple auto workers, and they saw this Chinese American man walking down the street. They assumed he was Japanese and they beat him to death. We mentioned already the immediate post-11 reaction, the violence from that. More recently, COVID being referred to as the Chinese virus, and now we're seeing racial profiling by ICE. So one of the things that I'd like to mention too is our liberty really depends on freedom of the press. We've seen that the AP has been denied access to certain venues. And it's important because it ensures an informed electorate and it facilitates public discourse, but it also helps us hold elected officials accountable. Okay, so let's talk now about the Alien Enemies Act. Excuse me a minute. I'm going to zoom off here a minute. Okay, so during my presentation in October of 2024 to the Heather Gardens group, I mentioned at the close of that the possibility that an administration could possibly use it to bypass procedural protections for immigrants by citing the invasion clause that's written into the language of the act. Now, the Alien Enemies Act, when you look at it, it actually has 3 prerequisites. One is there must be a declared war, and Congress only has the power to do that, or it has to be an invasion or predatory incursion. Now, on a sidebar, the law requires the invasion or predatory incursion to take place at the behest of, and this is right from the act, quote, a foreign nation or government. We'll come back to that in a minute. Okay, the second prerequisite, it has to be perpetrated by a foreign nation or government. And the third one is the president must issue a proclamation. So in my talk to them and today I'll present, I saw some challenges in that. One is the looseness of the terms invasion and predatory incursion, because in the act, it's not further defined or specified, whereas, you know, an act of war is pretty definite, and usually Congress declares war, and that's that. So that's pretty cut and dried. But there's a big gray area with invasion, with the terms invasion and predatory incursion. Also, one of the challenges that I saw and still see is there's this political question doctrine of the judicial system. So, and what that means is it's not subject to judicial review, and historically, the judiciary has given wide latitude to the executive branch and the legislative branch on areas where they say there's a political question, where it deals with potentially national security questions and such like that, and that this is areas where they feel that is not the province of the judiciary. And the last challenge that I see is the Korematsu case, which we'll come to in a minute, was overturned, but it's been revived. And the next slide or two will explain that. So let's talk about the equal protection and due process clauses in the Constitution and the Alien Enemies Act. So there seems to be a dichotomy. So there's two viewpoints. The anti-immigration viewpoint is that non-citizens from a foreign country, you have no rights in our country. But there is a Supreme Court precedent, and some legal scholars cite this, that non-citizens who have once passed through our gates, even illegally, may be expelled only after proceeding conforming to traditional standards of fairness. Now, looking at events of this week, we can see that there's really a tug of war back and forth between these two sides. So let's talk first about Korematsu versus the United States. This was a Supreme Court case, started in 1942. Fred Korematsu was a Nisei, second generation Japanese ancestry, so an American citizen, and he refused to comply with Executive Order 9066. He felt that it violated his rights, so he was arrested and convicted, but he appealed his case all the way up to the Supreme Court. It took until 1944 for the Supreme Court to hear his case. When they did, they ruled 6-3 in favor of the United States, and they upheld the conviction, citing military necessity. In 1983, there was a coram nobis petition filed in his behalf in district court in California. Now, the thing about coram nobis is if they can show that there was a manifest injustice and legal errors made, then the statute of limitations doesn't apply. So this was heard in district court, and the petition for coram nobis was granted, and it overturned Korematsu's conviction. So, and during that trial, the thing that convinced them, and they showed that, okay, so this is where manifest injustice was done. Korematsu's legal team, they presented unequivocal evidence, and because it came from the government's federal archives, that contradicted the government's claim that it was military necessity. That was why Korematsu had to be convicted and incarcerated. And what they showed in court was that the government suppressed, altered, or destroyed evidence to ensure it did not go before the Supreme Court in 1944 for review, and that this evidence would have blown up the government's military necessity argument, because there was really no basis for it. So why is it still relevant? It stands as a controversial decision because it highlights the balance between national security and civil liberties. Now, way back in 1944, one of the three dissenters, Justice Robert Jackson, in his dissenting opinion to the court's decision, he said that this decision lies about like a loaded weapon, ready for the hand of any authority that can bring forward a plausible claim of an urgent need. Sound familiar? All right. So now there's Korematsu and Trump v. Hawaii. This actually came up, the Korematsu case was actually cited in Trump v. Hawaii during his first term, and there's good news and bad news. So the good news is this: Korematsu, during the proceedings of Trump v. Hawaii in June of 2018, it was actually overturned by the court. So that's the good news. The bad news is it was overruled in name only. This gentleman, Neil Cattell, who writes in the Yale Law Journal, in May 2011, he was the acting Solicitor General. When he issued a confession of error acknowledging the mistakes made by the Solicitor General's office. Solicitor General is the attorney in the Department of Justice that represents the government in front of the Supreme Court. So he admitted mistakes made by the Solicitor General's office in the wartime handling of the Supreme Court cases. There was more cases, 3 more cases other than Korematsu that the Supreme Court heard. But this gentleman, Neil Cattell, who was the acting Solicitor General, when he reviewed this ruling in Trump v. Hawaii, he said himself that it's overruled in name only. He said they basically recreated the doctrine just under a different name. So the bottom line is, although Korematsu was overturned by the Supreme Court, they essentially reloaded the weapon. And because this is a more current ruling, they gave it renewed legitimacy. So why does this ruling fall short? I looked at this and I looked at a couple legal opinions, one of which was Cattell's article. And I think there's 3 areas where it falls short. So when you have to ask the question, what was overruled in Korematsu? And like both the authors of these 2 articles point out, it's nebulous, because basically the court failed to identify the principle or principles it was repudiating. When I was on active duty, we had a term for this. We called it eyewash, meaning it's somebody could say something or make a decree, and it might make you feel better, but there's no substance to it because it doesn't really change anything. And that's really what they're saying happened here. Now, there's 3 areas that they could have condemned Korematsu for and been specific. One was the racism on the part of the government that motivated 9066 and the subsequent actions that occurred as a result of it. They could have repudiated the weak legal reasoning and the decisions that were based on incomplete and fraudulent evidence. And there was a problem with setting the precedent that courts have no role when the government claims its actions are based on national security concerns. So again, getting back to that political question doctrine, even though that they say that these questions aren't subject to judicial review, there was a ruling in 1962, Baker v. Carr, and it says that the courts should not stand impotent before an obvious instance of manifestly unauthorized exercise of power. So that goes to that. As in Korematsu, the courts accepted at face value the government's assertions without examining evidence. So let's look at the Korematsu case. During World War II, the court accepted without question the government's evidence that the actions were justified. It was later demonstrated that it was primarily based on the claim of military necessity by Lieutenant General DeWitt, who at the time was commander of the Western Defense Command. And it was also shown that the government withheld from the court intelligence reports from the FBI, Naval Intelligence, and the FCC that refuted DeWitt's claims. Now you're saying maybe why the FCC, Federal Communications Commission. One of the claims that DeWitt made was that people of Japanese ancestry were using shore-to-ship radio to communicate information that could have been helpful to a Japanese enemy. That the FCC said there is no evidence that ever occurred. Okay, in Trump v. Hawaii, the government refused to produce the Department of Homeland Security report that they alleged supported the travel ban, and the court ruled in favor of the government without any review of this evidence. So it's like, okay, you're being tasked to make a judgment, but how can you make a judgment unless you see all the evidence? And in the last one, as in Korematsu, the court confined itself in a very narrow view of the proclamation while ignoring the broader context. Let me explain what that means. So in Korematsu was the underlying racial animus. In Trump v. Hawaii, it was the anti-Muslim animus. A narrow view of the proclamation means that they just look at the wording in the proclamation. Now, in both cases, the government, they're going to get smart lawyers and they're going to remove any language that would indicate that this is being motivated by racial animus in the case of Korematsu or anti-Muslim animus in the case of Trump v. Hawaii. But they said if you take a broader view and you put it in context, the context was that there was ample evidence in both these cases that showed that there was something else driving the train here. So let me talk now about the Alien Enemies Act and Tren de Aragua. So I think it's being used as a mechanism to short circuit normal immigration proceedings. The proclamation given by the president, or supposedly given by the president, although he says he didn't sign it, specifies that the gang members, specifies Tren de Aragua gang members, but in actual practice, it seems to be used and being used as a broad net to deport any immigrants, Tren de Agua or non-Tren de Agua. There's a current law of war, the Fourth Geneva Convention, of which the United States is a signatory, prohibits internment and deportation based on non-citizens' nationality, as opposed to conduct, which would require due process. Excuse me a minute. So you may all be aware of the action in federal appeals court right now. And I'll just give you a brief summary of that as I understand it. So the facts, the Department of Justice asked the Court of Appeals to overturn Judge Boasberg's temporary restraining order. Excuse me again a minute. There's a three-judge panel that's reviewing this in the appeals court. And one of the things that I saw from multiple sources is there is apparently an IC official, and he made a sworn statement that acknowledges that many of the deportees under the Alien Enemies Act did not have criminal records in the United States. So this is my take based on the news accounts that I've been able to read of proceedings. Both Judges Millett and Walker seem to agree that the detainees should have a chance to challenge allegations that they are actually part of the TDA gang. Although Judge Walker says that this should have happened in the appropriate district court, and he keeps saying this in Texas district court. Lee Gallant, who's an attorney for the ACLU, representing the deportees, he says that once the temporary restraining order expires, which I believe it's due to expire this Saturday unless it's renewed, his clients would be immediately deported without due process. And so maintaining the temporary restraining order would allow time for the factual record to be more fully developed. See if I had anything else. Questions. So, and I think that because there's people that, and you have seen some of the news reports, oh, this guy is getting deported just because he had tattoos that they thought were gang tattoos, and wasn't really the case. Let me see if I can. So, we have all these things happening. It's going to be interesting to see what the appeals court decides. One of the question marks is you notice that all the news reports that I've read said that only 2 of the 3-member panel were asking questions. The other judge that was named was basically just taking it all in during the hearing. So it'll be interesting to find out what what they decide. And I'm open for any questions that you may have.
Dean, that was great. Does anybody, if anybody has any questions, please raise your hand in the react button down at the bottom where there's a heart. And Dean, can you unshare your slides, please?
Undo what?
Unshare them.
Okay, I'll just do, there you go.
Does anybody have any questions? I'm curious, towards the beginning of your talk, you said that the government was already putting together background information, on the Japanese leadership even before Pearl Harbor.
Correct.
I'm just wondering why.
Well, that's one of the things that the FBI does. It's in their purview. Let me click this one.
So why were they viewed as a threat at that point?
Well, if you remember, there was naval intelligence, army intelligence. There was no Air Force at the time because at that point it was a wing of the Army, the Army Air Corps.
Uh-huh.
But you had the FBI. There was no CIA then. And
Right.
then World War II was the OSS, but that wasn't even developed yet till after the Pearl Harbor. So you have two military intelligence agencies and the FBI, which was also tasked with producing intelligence summaries. And they could sort of see that these war clouds on the horizon because, Japan was doing a lot of saber rattling at the time. They had already, invaded China.
Uh-huh.
And there was talk back and forth between their diplomats in the United States saying, hey, we want this, this. And of course, we threatened them back by, hey, we're going to cut off your, we were sending them iron and scrap metal. And so it's this kind of thing going back and forth. And the discussions could probably be truthfully characterized as getting more and more belligerent. So anybody in intelligence would probably realize that, hey, if we're doing our jobs, we better start looking at some of these folks. And they did. So the FBI in particular, they do what the FBI does. They make dossiers on people. They may never have to use that dossier and put it into action, but their thinking was, if this happens, we want to be ready. So immediately after Pearl Harbor, the FBI started rounding up people in these Japanese American communities. And, from the accounts that I've read, some of them, like this one account I read, this one guy, he was like the head of some Japanese American social group in his committee. But because he was viewed as a threat, they took him away. So he was separated from his family. They didn't put him in one of those 10 war relocation authority camps. They put him in a separate government camp that was, really more like a prison. And he never saw his family again for several years. And here's the thing too, nobody in his family knew where all they knew was that the feds came, they arrested him, they put him in the back of the car. And that's the last they saw of him for years because they were never informed where he was or anything else.
Can we talk a little bit about Korematsu? And I think that you did discuss this pretty extensively, but I'd like to emphasize it. And that's they discovered that even though the government said they were putting them into in concentration camps because they were spies or they could be spies, that actually what they uncovered in the Korematsu Quorum Notice case is that they knew at the time that was incorrect. But because the government said it was a security risk, the courts didn't go any further. And I think that has extreme relevance today because what you have is the judge in the district court wants to know, did they abide by his order to stop the deportation? The government won't say the number of people they deported under the Alien Enemies Act. They won't say what the security risk is, and the danger is that the courts might decide based on Korematsu and Trump versus Hawaii that because this government is saying it's a secret, there's nothing they can do. Um, and so that's why it's crucial today is how much do we look behind the executive action to see, is this an abuse or is this real? And because it was in wartime in Korematsu, you can say, well, maybe they have a little bit more leeway. But when they reloaded it in Trump versus Hawaii, then we get this different area where there is no war. And are we going to look at abuse or are we not?
Right. So there's a bunch of different answers here. First off, let me say that and again, I had a feeling that this administration, if they were elected successfully in November, because I mentioned this to the Heather Gardens social justice group, that they were going to try to use the invasion clause in the Alien Enemies Act because there was no declared war.
Right.
And in fact, if you remember all during the campaign period, you see these campaign ads and you see a certain person who I will leave unnamed saying invasion this, invasion that. So basically, they were early on trying to lay the groundwork for using this. And uh, the so that was already there. They were determined to go down this path.
Right.
Now, again, this whole political question doctrine that the judiciary uses, I personally think that they are giving too much latitude to the executive branch in this case because, okay, declared war by Congress, that's pretty cut and dry. On these other two areas, those aren't as cut and dry. So because if they have a gray area like that, okay, so the government you're claiming invasion, to me, but I'm not a legal scholar, they need to bring proof into court that can prove that is this truly an invasion and what is the threat to national security. Now, if they need to, you know, close the courtroom and what do they call that? Doing it in camera. So basically, if there's information that is classified, it's not heard outside the confines of the attorneys and the judge or judges in this case. I think that should happen. Now, while I'm speaking on that, though, let me point out, like in Korematsu, I always wonder because the government destroyed, and they had proof, the government destroyed, suppressed, and they altered evidence. So that there's a large group of evidence that never made it in front of the Supreme Court in 1944. And I think this is why that Coram Nobis petition was accepted, because you have to wonder, well, because the government willfully withheld this information from the Supreme Court, so it was never entered into the court record, the justices never got a chance to hear it, would they have voted differently had they heard this evidence? And I think the reasonable person would have said, yes, very likely they would have. It might have been 6-3 the other way. But because the government, willfully suppressed this evidence, and I say willfully because there is a gentleman, I think his name is Ennis. He was a junior attorney in the Justice Department, and he came across this, and he was also privy to the naval intelligence reports, the FCC, the FBI reports, and he said basically, look, he tried telling the Solicitor General, his boss, hey, you can't go forward with this. And, you know, if this, we have this evidence, you can't withhold this from the Supreme Court, you know, that would be illegal. But his boss, it was the Solicitor General Fahey, basically blew him off. And so what he and this other gentleman did is they wrote a memorandum for record that was later discovered by that Aiko Yoshikawa and her associate. And later on, fortunately, Mr. Ennis was still alive. And so at the age of 76, he was called to testify in the Coram Nobis case. And, you know, he basically said that, yes, we knew this. I tried informing my superior, but he basically, you know, sort of blew me off. And he had the memorandum for record. And I know about this because being in the Army for 29 years, there were occasions where I tried to advise my commander and he didn't want to hear it. So I wrote a memorandum for record. Fortunately, one of my commanders, we were out for a run and I informed him and he said, no, that's not what we're going to do. So I said, okay, sir, I'm just going to inform you that when we get back to the office and before I pick up my stuff and go home, I'm going to write a memorandum for record. He came in the next day, and I guess after sleeping on it overnight and thinking about it, he said, you know what, you're right, we can't withhold this information. And so he went ahead, but that's certain commonly that people do in the federal government to sort of protect themselves, to say, look, I did my thing, I informed my superior, what he did with that is on him, not on me. So, you know, that goes too, but really that it's incredible the amount of evidence, potential evidence that should have gone in front of the Supreme Court in 1944, but they were never allowed to hear because the government suppressed or destroyed it.
Yeah, and so they incarcerated 120,000 people,
Yes.
knowing that there was no reason. So while you were speaking this time, I made a couple of notes about what our situation is today. So with the Japanese incarceration, they incarcerated 120,000 people. Now, this is not under the Alien Enemies Act, but right now we have 46,269 people in immigration detention facilities in the United States. 49.9% of them, this is as of March 2025, have no criminal charges or criminal record. These people are just sitting in a detention facility, which, if we look at the definition that Dean gave us, fits the definition of a concentration camp. They are right now trying to increase the capacity of detention facilities in the United States. And you heard that Hart Mountain, they used green wood. Well, in this case, according to Project 2025, they envision having soft-sided structures, which is
Tents,
what they
basically.
call tents. Then when we talk about the Fair Play Committee and the loyalty oath, and think about that, the question that they're asking, are you going to be loyal to the United States? And now we're detaining students for speech that is anti-US foreign policy. And that would just be free speech. And then I also put that because it was a wartime, They were concerned about induction into the military, but under an incursion, now they're just concerned about how you talk. And then the reasons for the incarceration are security reasons, racial prejudice. Now it's basically coming from a foreign country, being born in another country. And so I think there's a lot of similarities now just with our whole immigration and detention policy. I did also want to ask you, Dean, one of the reasons they said that people were incarcerated was for their protection. Did your parents say anything about feeling endangered at the
No,
time?
they didn't really mention that, although at the time on the entire West Coast, there was a lot of anti-Japanese sentiment.
Mhm.
But you know, I think the government was stretching that a little bit, if you ask me, because you know, it's one thing to protect people, but it's another to, you know, round them up, deprive them of their livelihoods, deprive them of their property, move them to a place in the country where they've never been. And all 10 camps, if you go and look, like you could do a Google map search and look, they were in some of the most desolate, undesirable parts of the country where they made those 10 camps.
Mhm.
You know, for instance, the ones in Arizona, um, was basically out there in the desert. And on one of them in particular, and this is still a little bit of a dispute because they they put it on some land that they promised to um, one of the Native American tribes. So they basically had that land by treaty, but all of a sudden, you know, they got superseded by the government saying, well, we need this back. We're going to use this. And so that created a little bit of a stir. I mean, the ones in Arkansas, they were basically out in some swamp that was drained. Um, you know, Tule Lake is and I'm a native Californian, so I know that terrain. It's up in the very northeastern corner of the state if you look on the map, and there's not a whole lot there except volcanic badlands. Um, and actually that because it was maybe one of the more inhospitable camps. And Kathy, you and I talked about this. They had the biggest camp population because what the WRA decided is if you were labeled as a troublemaker in one of the other 9 camps, you quickly got a ticket to Tule Lake because that's where they kept all the quote troublemakers so they could keep them all in one place and keep an eye on
Yeah,
them, I
that was
guess.
even more like a prison.
Yeah.
Well, it's 7 o'clock. If anybody has any final
Well,
question,
one thing has anybody else actually downloaded the actual proclamation? You know, the one that
the
Trump either signed or didn't sign? Because if you look at the wording on this, it very much targets the Tren de Aragua group. And in the language of the proclamation, he they try to tie it with the government of Venezuela. So I think to make that sort of equivalent to that sort of state actor foreign power, that was one of the requirements of the Alien Enemies Act. Now, I bring that up only because of this. So based on what's going on in the appeals court and what Judge Boasberg has said, you know, Judge Boasberg, I read a statement that he thought, you know, somebody asked him, well, why didn't you challenge the constitutionality aspect of the American um, Alien Enemies Act? And he said he didn't want to go there because that was too broad for this particular situation. So what he's focused on and what the two of the judges on that appeals panel and the ACLU lawyer, they both bring up the question of due process. Judge Boasberg himself has brought that up, and that's what they're trying to boil this down to is, okay, so
Yeah,
in
and
the
that'll be
proclamation,
interesting.
you identify this Venezuelan gang. And so then basically, I think what I hear all of them saying is that that puts the onus on the government to allow time for anybody that's been accused and rounded up under this proclamation, to give them a chance to prove whether they're actually a gang member or not. And we know already that there, there's been some mistaken arrests or roundups. And so you may have people that really aren't Trinidad and they're being deported without due process. And I think that's what's thrown up the red flag for two of the justices on this appeals court and for the ACLU lawyer and Judge Boasberg is, well, look, you can't just pick people out willy-nilly and say, well, you're an immigrant, you're a non-American citizen, so we have the right to round you up. Oh, yeah, okay, so you get rounded up, but you should get your day in court, is what they're saying, and have your chance to, secure a lawyer and be able to prove whether you're in this gang or not. What's happening is, see, the government is trying to speed everything along. Why? I mean, why did they put people on those flights and get them up in the airborne before Boasberg had a chance to make his judgment? Because what they're trying to do is, in my opinion, speed things up to the point where people don't have time for due process. And I think that's what, two of the judges on the appeals panel are concerned about. Definitely the ACLU guy is concerned about, and what Judge Boasberg is concerned about is, you know, are these arrests going to continue to happen? Yes, they are. But before we arrest people, we're finding that they're arresting people that were here trying to apply for asylum, et cetera, et cetera. So, let's make sure that the people that we're going to actually put on an airplane, never to see again, they get their day in court. Is I think that's the message I'm getting, and I support that. I think that, that is the fair thing to do, because you may be sending people that came here either seeking asylum, or we're hearing reports now that they're basically deporting people that had like a permanent alien status here, and they're being rounded up and they're not being allowed their day in court.
Right. Due process is the key to almost everything in America, and the Japanese didn't get it, and the people that were on those flights didn't get it. And a lot of people that have been here less than 2 years are not getting it. So this has been a really interesting discussion. I hope you guys appreciated it as much as I do. Dean, that was fantastic. I'm glad that you felt well enough to do this program. I know you're under the weather. So I really appreciate everybody hanging in there.
And
And
Kathy, I wanted to ask the gentleman, uh, the Germans were involved in World War II as well. Why didn't they have camps for them? I mean,
They actually were there was a much smaller number of Germans and Italians, because they were on the part of the Axis, so they were our enemies too. They were also rounded up, and in fact, let me see if I have that. One of the judges on the panel, she actually mentions that. She says, "Look, during World War II, when these Nazis were being rounded up in the United States, they were afforded their day in court and due process, and they said we treated the Nazis better than we're treating these current deportees."
yeah, I think that's true, but we also treated the Nazis better than we treated the Japanese. Um,
And if I
and
may,
I think
there
that's
is,
just racial prejudice.
sorry, but If I may, there was a German camp just outside of Rockford, Illinois that I've been to. So it has memorabilia about the whole process at that
Yes,
point.
ma'am. And in fact, when I was stationed at, now they keep changing the name back and forth, so it might be Fort Gordon, Augusta again. But the Army has a post, and or is it still Fort Eisenhower? Who knows? He's trying to change all the names back and forth. But there is a small German cemetery that a lot of people don't know about on post, right on the inside the gate at Fort Gordon / Fort Eisenhower.
And I think another reason is also because there were a large number of German and Italian immigrants that were already very ensconced in American life.
Yes.
And they didn't do the Japanese on the East Coast either. They only did the ones on the West Coast. Is that right, Dee?
Yes, if you were in the exclusion zone, which included all the Pacific Coast states and the western part of Arizona, because they felt if you were in that area, you were a potential threat to national defense, so you had to move out of that exclusion area.
Which they knew wasn't true. Which really irritates me. But so anyhow, any other questions? Any other comments? Well, thanks for coming, you guys. Don't forget, next Tuesday, April 1st, we have Jason Crow from the 6th Congressional District. He's going to talk about some of the federal immigration and detention policies. Jason is one of the congressmen that has been, to put it not quite as nice as maybe you would, he's been forcing inspections of the Aurora detention facilities. So his staff actually goes in there to look at conditions. So that's coming up. And then April 15th, we'll hear from Elizabeth Jordan, who's the director of the University of Denver Law School Immigration Clinic. So those are our programs coming up. Thanks for coming tonight, and
Hey,
we.
Kathy, could I say one more thing before we sign off?
Yeah, sure, Dee.
Okay. Yeah, it's come to my attention, you know, that there is a they're trying to get a bill onto the floor of Congress again. I think this has happened one or two times before, to try to repeal the Alien Enemies Act.
Yeah,
Now, do I think it has a chance? No, not with the particular makeup of Congress that we have right now. But I mean, you know, it's like, I guess every once in a while you got to keep trying. The other thing though is, you know, I didn't used to contribute, you know, send donations to people like the ACLU or the Southern Poverty, you know, Law Group. And I'm not trying to do an ad for them, because there's other worthy organizations out there. But in my opinion, right now, the remedy is going to come through the legal side, not through the legislative side. And so if you ever had inklings of making a donation to help folks out, because, you know, to get these attorneys up there, it costs some money. Just think about that. I hadn't thought about that until recently, but my wife and I have started making contributions because we feel that this is a worthy cause, and right now it's the only viable remedy based on the composition of Congress right now.
Could you
Thank-
repeat those two law? You said,
Beg your pardon?
you said the two things to contribute to. Could you repeat them again?
Well, and these are the ones that my family contributes to. It's the ACLU and the Southern Poverty Law Center, which are both very invested in making sure that people's rights are protected. There are other good groups out there, I'm sure, if you investigate a little bit. So I'm not trying to basically be an ad for either of those two groups. I'm just saying that look around, and if you find a group that you think is worthy of your support, but now's the time because, you know, we can't let things go too far without these legal challenges or, you know, if we get behind the 8 ball too far, we're gonna basically look up and say, where did our democracy go?
And the League of Women Voters is also active in aligning themselves with the ACLU and some of our other partner organizations.
And we do plenty of litigation as well.
Right.
Right.
But
So I
thank
didn't
you.
mean to sound like I was proselytizing, but I
Nope.
do want to
You're
remind
good.
people, you know,
Okay.
sometimes we have to put our money where our mouth is.
Yep. Well, thanks a lot, Dean. This has been fantastic. So thank you very much. We
Hey,
went a
thank you
little
for inviting
over.
me.
And
We
thank
went-
you, Dean.
Yeah, we went 15 minutes over and we had an audience the whole time. We had about 30 people consistently throughout the program. More people will see the recording. So I think, you know, you got the word out and we're very appreciative, Dean.
Okay, thank you very much again for the invitation.
Thank you, Dean.
You.
Okay, bye-bye, everybody.